in order to just give you a bit of an overview of what we're aiming at, obviously we want to create these materials, we want them to be used by our universities and also to be incorporated in other universities' curricula. But the idea, like the motivation behind our work and what we want to achieve with it is, first of all, to create content that will help prepare students a bit more for the reality of the job market rather than the academic aspects of life. So that's why we're taking a more hands-on approach into this. Another really important aspect, at least to me and to many of us who are a bit more technically oriented rather than simply academic, is to sensitize academics with respect to the skills that employers are actually looking for, because we tend to go very, very strong on theory, and I include myself in this. But then employers are looking also for efficiency, effectiveness, and all these other things that are not really taught at university level unless you're engaged in a hands-on project. We also want to raise awareness, and this is actually very important in many of the communities that our universities are based in, raise awareness among employers about the skills that a linguist or a language graduate can bring to the job, right? Because they tend to advertise positions only for computer engineers or scientists or whatnot. But then there is also the expertise within our field. To create engaging modular learning content. This is actually, the result that we will capitalize on in the whole process. This, obviously, because this is funded by the EU, is going to be freely accessible to everyone. And our aim is not just to create another set of materials, but also to make them as engaging as possible in the sense. I mean, you'll hear more about this afternoon, how we're trying to do that and all that. And also we want to promote I think it's already starting to show that the university are shifting their strategies from, lecturing only modes to more active learning and research-based learning. I think so. We want to promote this even further and incorporate transversal skills that are needed beyond academia, also in the workplace. So this was a very, very short overview. I'm pretty sure that you'll hear more about all this stuff in the coming hours. If you want to join in, I hope you would. There is the project website, where you can find the link to the mailing list as well in order to get updated about things on UPSKILLS. There is a Facebook group and there is also a Twitter handle. Feel free to join us, especially those of you online as well, because you're already on your computers and whatnot. And that's all from me. Thank you very much. And thanks for joining, by the way. Yeah. I think we have a question. Let me just try and... Are causing shared content to be blocked? Okay. I'm not entirely sure. Could I ask whoever raised their hand, Canela, I think it was the name, and Isabel. How do I don't know. Can you help me? I don't know how this works.
So we will check and if someone from the audience came up to ask.
Sure. Okay, maybe they were just trying to say hi or something, and so there are no questions, I take it. If there are, please raise your hand.
If you have questions from via
okay,
WebEx.
Isabel.
Right.
How do I go to her? I don't know. Okay, would you please ask your question, Isabel?
Yeah.
No, okay, sorry. By mistake? No. Okay, let's move on, I guess. I don't know.
Okay, if there are no questions, then let's thank the speaker again.
Thank you.
And move on to our next talk. Before the next talk, let me first make some additional technical remarks. One is that if anyone from the audience uses WebEx, which is actually recommended, then your video is also included. Please just keep the microphone off and the speakers to avoid microphone. We didn't have it so far, so I guess there's no issue about that. The other thing is, again, like we had it right now, for the people via WebEx, please just use the raise hand or try to wave in your own camera if you want to ask a question, or even just start speaking, hoping that not two people will do it at the same time. Now we can move on I need to stay here. We can move on to our next talk. The talk will be given by our colleague from the University of Graz, Professor Barbara Hinger. I will briefly introduce her. Professor Hinger obtained her, well, right now Professor Hinger is a professor of foreign language education at the University of Graz. She is affiliated with the Institute for Romance Linguistics, but she is actually in charge for a broader range of languages in the area of foreign language education. Professor Hinger obtained her PhD in Innsbruck, where she also obtained 2 master degrees, one as well as the PhD in the area of foreign language education, and 1 master in the area of women's studies. Professor Hinger was, before coming to Graz, she was professor in Innsbruck too, where she was also the head of the Department of Foreign Language, head of the Department of subject-specific education, and also the leader of the group in foreign language education, where she initiated and co-authored the establishing of an approach to foreign language education, which is known as the Innsbruck model of foreign language education. So without further taking further time from the talk, I leave the floor to Professor.
Thank you very much for introducing me and for having me with you. Oh, let's see the technical problems, I guess. Yeah, okay, here we go. Firstly, I had to smile because, well, these are all my concerns. I was really challenged and I'm not quite sure how my talk will fit into your project. But anyhow, we just will get started. And my brief overview might make you smile because the first point is needs analysis, which we know by now that the project has already realized or will finish shortly anyhow. And then I would like to make you familiar with the skill acquisition model.
Sharing on the WebEx. So
oh, okay.
Sorry, because we're still in the old slides. So sharing presenter to continue. Yes, I don't know why I changed the presenter to Carlos, but this is us. We can make ourselves presenter, and then we have to share your slides. Sorry for this.
Yeah. Later on. Yeah. And I will go into further details on textbook knowledge, areas of practice, and yeah, we will see how linguistic theory, applied linguistics, and language teaching might relate. Anyhow, what you already have said about needs analysis is an approach which especially is taken up by the so-called task-based language teaching approach, but you also mentioned task-based learning in the framework of your project. And firstly, of course, we could ask what are the skills our linguistics and language students would need. Do we agree or do we define their skills in our curriculum, in our curricular goals? Or do we go to the professional field or to the job market? Or can we know which jobs they will fulfill afterwards? All these questions are raised also by Michael Long, who is one of the most important or prominent authors in needs analysis accordingly to task-based language teaching. The Dreyfus model of skill acquisition, I'm sure you are familiar with or you work with it. It starts with the definition of what a novice is in a new field, and it goes on till the novice has reached expert status. And we do have different skill levels or skill grades here, from recollecting information, recognizing problems, decision making, and of course being aware of different situations, etc., etc. Okay. This model is also translated into the so-called novice to expert scale, which refers to the different steps, of course, but then it defines knowledge, standard of work, autonomy, keeping with complexity and perception of context, and it's kind of a gradual model as well. I have just taken up 4 of the areas here. We start with textbook knowledge, go on to knowledge of areas of practice, and link the knowledge of area of practice to our background knowledge. And only then we get a deeper understanding of the discipline and different areas of practice. We can relate with the novice status, the beginners, the competent and the proficient person, so to say. But it is also shown that it takes quite some time to achieve the expert status, so at least 5 to 10 years. And do we have this time in our bachelor and master degree? I would argue that we don't have so much time, but that we can lay the ground for our students anyhow. And I also would like to point out that in language teaching and in language learning, we do have a quite similar module of skill acquisition, which is the Common European Framework of Reference. You all are familiar with the CFR. And you can see here that the different levels, starting with A1 and ending at C2, also defines a beginner status, or the basic user, as it is called in the Common European Framework. The independent user, the competent user, could be the competent user, and the proficient user at the end. If we ever get experts or really proficient in a second language, we don't know, and it depends. Depends on the individual, etc., etc. I would argue that textbook knowledge for linguistics and language students need to take into account at least 2 turns in our field. The first one is, of course, the Chomskyan turn, and the second one would be the pragmatic turn. But as you have introduced me, you all know by now that I am a language educator, and of course these 2 kinds of turns are important, I would say, in my field. So in the future professional field of my students, who would become language teachers, of course, and with a special focus on school contexts. You all are familiar with what is said here, the Chomskyan turn, also called the cognitive turn, based on his PhD thesis, but of course I would argue on his review of verbal behavior published by Skinner in the early 50s. And out of this came his definition of universal grammar, the innate language acquisition device, of course, and the most important example, I would say, against behaviorism and against imitation, or the importance of imitation when it comes to language learning or to language acquisition, the examples of overgeneralization, which can't be an imitation, as you all know. For my field, the significance of error in language acquisition is maybe one of the most important changes going back to Chomsky, and we now would argue that errors are necessary steps in language acquisition, that they give us insights into the language development in our brain. And of course, one could ask, is error correction necessary anymore in language education? I leave it like that. Nowadays, we also do have neurolinguistic evidence for Chomsky's universal grammar when it comes to syntax. And here I just would like to point out Angela Friederici and her book published in 2017. You might know that she works at the Max Planck Institute at Leipzig University, and really is doing a great job with all her team, supporting Chomsky's revolution, so to say. But I would say that we also would need to make our students familiar with all the critics against Chomsky, as well as with further developments. And I just have pointed out here two of maybe the most important critics against universal grammar emergentism in linguistics theory and the usage-based approach in when it comes to language teaching and language learning. But of course, Chomsky's approach was supported quite early on by evidence-based investigations or by empirical studies. And the most important, I would say, is definitely that from Pitt Coda analyze or his error analysis, and maybe for language teaching, the monitor model defined by Stephen Krashen. I will come back to Stephen Krashen in a couple of minutes. It was Larry Selinker who coined the term interlanguage hypothesis. He might agree with Chomsky or he might not agree with Chomsky. I would say this is not really important. Important is the definition here and the term interlanguage, because nobody else could name this way from the L1, so to say, to the target language, but this was maybe the most important contribution made by Selinker, just the term as such, interlanguage. And it is still a big challenge for language learners as well as for language teachers, because it takes quite some time it takes us quite some time to go from the input or the accessible language data to the output. And we might we might really be aware of this time needed for our language learners. And we should know that input is not output, even though practicing in school and practicing at university in language courses maybe does say so, but in between we do have all the mental processing of language data. The second turn I would like to mention here is a pragmatic turn in linguistics in the 1960s by especially by Austin and Searle, How to Do Things with Words. You are all familiar with this title from Austin, and then the development of the speech act theory by Searle. And for language educators or for language teachers, the most important thing is that we really could define language in use. So what are we able to do with language? And in the language classroom, we can see 10 years later the communicative term in language teaching. So the most important question again was here, how to use language outside the language classroom in the target country. And the communicative turn put forward a harsh critique of the audiolingual and audiovisual method. We still can find quite some elements of this method in our contemporary textbooks, even if we are not aware of it. You all might know pattern drill exercises, which go back to behaviorism. We get an input and we have to answer it correctly if we are able to, or we have to be corrected immediately if we can't answer it correctly. And of course, the audiolingual and audiovisual method does not only go back to behaviorism in psychology, but in linguistics or in linguistics theory to the structural approach in the US starting in the 30s, 40s of the last century, and put forward in the contrastive hypothesis where linguists tried to make sure or to define the differences between VL1 and the target language to be learned in a school setting or in a classroom setting in language schools. And the results of contrastive analysis were captured, so to say, in the pattern drill exercises. So even if the goal was to use the language in an oral way, the way to use the language was based on linguistic structures. The areas of practice, I would argue, of course, again, from my point of view and from my professional background, could be the language classroom. And here we would need to stress the positive view of error and the change, the big change, I would still argue, from deficit orientation to a culture of positive feedback, which can also be found in the Common European Framework of Reference. If we read the different the definitions of the different scales, we can find that the error is still in place up to the level of C1, so really the competent user of a target language. And different approaches to language learning, of course, have been developed, such as the natural approach by Creation and his colleague Terrell. The natural approach is not really taken over in our European context, but it is still important in language textbooks in the US. Then, of course, what I already mentioned, the communicative approach with really a big opposition to the pattern drill activities, the pattern drill exercises, starting by putting forward firstly receptive exercises, then reproductive, productive, and only as a last step, creative exercises. And what was really new in the communicative approach are the information and opinion gap activities or exercises. Learners do have different kinds of informations, or they may have different opinions, and in order to fulfill a more complex task, they just need to communicate. They need to use the new language. No structure is given here. They just need to communicate to get the task fulfilled. And of course, as the project leader already mentioned, the task-based language approach, which focuses on performing a task in the target language and which establishes a so-called task cycle, which you can see here. The task cycle as such asks the students to fulfill a task, and then they are given enough time to plan their presentation before the whole group and to report on their task fulfillment. But you also see that we do have a so-called pre-task phase. In the pre-task phase, we kind of prepare the students to be able to fulfill the tasks. We rely on their knowledge they already have, content knowledge, but also linguistic knowledge, vocabulary, etc. And thereafter, we do have a third phase called a language focus, where we can analyze what the task looked like, which structures would have been needed in order to fulfill the tasks, which structures the students really were able to use when fulfilling the task, and we can give them exercises and we can make them practice afterwards, not beforehand. I would argue that the task-based language approach is really in opposition with the so-called PPP model, the present, practice, and produced model, which we find all over the world. It is not only in Austria, not only in the European context, really in so many language classrooms all over the world, might it be school contexts or private language classes, whatever. We present a structure to the student who wants to learn a new language, and then we give them exercises to practice the structure, and only then we ask the student to produce it. The task-based language approach does it differently. We first ask the students to fulfill the task, to produce a language, the language they are able to produce. Thereafter, we give them the opportunity to reflect and analyze the language they used, and then we see what they still need to go on to learn more, and then we offer them practice examples and so on. So I would say task-based language, the task-based language approach or task-based language teaching focuses not only more on the language, on the student, as an individual, but also on the developmental path of language acquisition, which can be taken into account in the last phase, in the practice phase, when we focus on the language structures. So from textbook knowledge to areas of practice, I would argue that theoretical linguistics, as I just tried to point out very briefly and very shortly, is the baseline for our students. But then, of course, they have to be able to see what applied linguistics has been able so far to make out of theoretical approaches. And then, of course, it only can come to language teaching. And here I would like to ask you to read this quote. It's from Hallstein, 2013, and it refers back to creation's monitor model or monitor hypothesis. For me, it is quite an important quote, and you will understand my argument shortly. So. And isn't that a beautiful quote? Maybe only for me, I'm not sure. But this would be an argument for our students to really know also theoretical inputs and to be aware of the fact that maybe it takes some time, and it's definitely not Creation who has been able to prove his claim on an empirical way, but others did, and maybe even not in order to prove Creation's approach, but it just turned out that by their results, Creation could be Creation's approach could be proved. And in the next slide, it is the same quote, but underneath you see a quote, a more recent quote from Rod Ellis, 2020. He refers to Creation's monitor model, of course, as a pre-scientific theory, and I would say we have to agree. It was kind of an intuitive hypothesis, so to say, yeah. But we should know the pathway this hypothesis has taken, and we should make our students familiar with these kind of things, I would argue. And this is one drawing from Creation himself. So the monitor model, motivation, self-esteem, anxiety is important for him in order to process the input so that the language acquisition device, the LAD, can really start to work. And in between we see the filter he speaks of. And this would be a German example. Just one brief note on Creation. He of course, was very aware of the harsh critics he received from the scientific community. And what did he do? He did not go the same way. He did not start to reply, well, of course, in the beginning, but further on, he just didn't want to reply anymore to his critics, but he take a different pathway, and that is the extensive reading approach. And there he did his empirical research, not alone, but in a group of people, in a team, etc., etc. And the extensive reading approach is really widespread nowadays. We can say we do have empirical results, and empirical results underpin the extensive reading approach. We do have conferences on an international level, etc., etc. And of course, what does the extensive reading approach is the very same thing what Creation argued in the early 60s or 70s, the difference between language acquisition and language learning. So extensive reading still is an implicit approach to language acquisition. It does not make language structures explicit. And what is interesting to me, at least, is that others who may not agree with Creation took up his motivation, self-esteem, and anxiety arguments. And we can see from the mid-1980s onwards a very huge body of studies into foreign language anxiety, starting with Horwitz and Horwitz, and lately also some investigations in foreign language enjoyment. So again, it is one person who puts out a pre-scientific theory, and then it spreads in different ways, and we can see empirical results and investigations in it. I'm not sure whether we can handle this, but maybe I would ask you to come and help me again. I would like to show you just a very short part of Zoltán Törny's talk on safe speaking environments, and you will see in a second, in the next presentation. Yeah, sorry for that. We could have prepared. Now, I guess we have to.
We have to go out.
Exactly. It's
yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, here we go.
We will change the share. Let's first open this one. Pause it, and then change what we share. Stop sharing, and then open this one. Oh,
Otherwise, we.
No, it's coming soon. It's this one. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Zoltán Törny is, you might know his name. He is the motivational researcher, so to say. We will see. We don't really need his introduction. He's a bit nervous. Well, otherwise, I just would like to, well, let's see. Yeah.
I think the audience doesn't hear it. So.
No, we don't need to hear it. I just would like to show the slide.
Okay.
But can the online audience see it?
The slide is.
The slide. Okay. Törny speaks or tries to explain why a safe speaking environment for language learners is important, and he can draw on a huge, very extensive study from Cambridge University, where almost or more than 90% of all the students on an international level answers that speaking in the foreign language classroom is what most fear creates in them. But we all know this, etc., etc. And one of the conclusions from Törny would be that our students also not only need to know theory, etc., etc., but they also need to have skills in group dynamics. In group dynamics for education, but also for small groups. And I would argue that knowing or being acquainted and familiar with group dynamics helps in professional fields, in any kind of professional field. And now I would like to go back to my slide. And would it be possible, or is the online audience still? No.
Okay, yeah. And then right.
Yeah, here we go. Thank you. Okay, so for the language learning, for learning foreign languages, the overall objective, of course, would be to reach the communicative competence in the target language. We do have a common European framework and the companion volume nowadays with theoretical inputs, but we still need to know, all what I just have tried to say, that reception and comprehension is the baseline when it comes to the mental processing, and only then are we able to produce something in the target language. But we also would need analyzing skills for analyzing language structures, maybe literary competencies, inter and transcultural competencies, and of course we also need to evaluate the communicative competence, so to say, assessment literacy, and this might be something you could. Here we go. You could use for your project. I'm not too sure, because Taylor in 2013 put forward a differential assessment literacy model, so to say. She pointed out 4 different professional profiles: test writers, classroom teachers, university administrators, and professional language testers. Of course, this might be defined in a different way for linguistics and language students, but you see here the definitions of different areas of knowledge and technical skills, principles and concepts, language pedagogy, local practices, personal beliefs, and scores and decision making, of course. And for all of the 4 professional fields she defines, the skills would be needed in different scales, in a different grade. And maybe that could be an inspiration for you to work on in your project, just that you defining the skills you think, or the results from the needs analysis, and then define what different professional fields would make out of it. Okay. And of course, for language teaching, we also do have the European portfolio for student teachers of languages. Maybe this kind of portfolio would also be one of the results of your wonderful projects. And finally, I do have some questions. Are we all in the same boat if we work in a specific university department? Do we know what our colleagues teach? Do they know what we teach, study, or research? Do we exchange our teaching philosophy? Do we cooperate? Can our students see this kind of collaboration? Do we interpret the curricular goals on a common basis? Do we share and discuss these goals with our students? Do we make them transparent so that we can see the usefulness, or they can give us their arguments? Do we share our own professional development and our job history, which might be of interest or not, with our colleagues, with our students? And the final question, how mindful are we with each other, with ourselves, and with our students, Yeah, and here I come to an end. I'm not sure whether I really whether my input would be useful for you, but I'm definitely open and very much would appreciate your questions, remarks, thoughts, additional information. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I see already many ways in which what you presented is useful for us. Are there questions? Marco, you let me know if there are answers now. Comments?
Very useful for us, and because part of what we're is also, applying a pedagogical approach to figure out how it is to how we can make for me the biggest thing is what you pointed out in the end, like these people, and especially lecturers, to change the ways in certain ways and sort of like create healing. Yeah. And I think that this is the biggest challenge. I mean, for the students, I think that you can sort of convince the alternative and you'll see how to do what we want. The lectures is quite tricky to get. That's why I think that this is why we also try I didn't say relate it same, but basically, when we apply the same, we will create content that people can incorporate in the lecture rather than create, full-blown curriculum that they have in each. But I'm pretty interested, and I'm very interested in looking up this.
Yeah. Thank you.
If I may briefly just summarize for the audience via WebEx, so Stavros Assimakopoulos, our coordinator of the UPSKILLS project, said that the presentation was relevant for us also because we are interested in the pedagogical aspects and problems of the stuff we are working on. And that he finds that I'm summarizing, that the biggest challenge is probably actually to get the teachers to communicate with each other and to share all these issues that have been mentioned in one of the last slides.
And this takes us back to group cohesion and group dynamics. Yeah.
It's a good thing we're recording this.
Yeah, exactly. Because in the end, we are always working in the team. Maybe know it or not, or maybe be aware of it or not. Yeah.
And it's also, we've also figured out there, because we're also working in a team, you can even see within our skills.
Sure.
How there are different perspectives to the same sort of problem.
Yeah.
So even within us, supposedly we have a sworn, a way of looking at things from the application, whatnot. But even there, you can see that there are different perspectives, and I think it's it's interesting to not space where everyone to sort of but still forward that more. So.
Thank you.
I think there was. Is this there?
Just ask if you can show the slide with the questions again.
So maybe actually you can send us the slides if it's okay with you, and then we can share it with the people who attended. Yeah. There was one more question or comment, or Stavros, yeah. So the question is, why is it such a challenge to get the teachers to share practices and communicate with each other?
Shall I answer?
Yep. I think, yeah.
A very strong opinion. I mean, most of the time.
Yeah.
This would be start learning. So everything. But generally the problem a lot about stuff, so they find ways to follow.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, of course.
Part and parcel of the job.
Yeah. And when it comes to teaching at the end, the classroom is our floor.
Yeah.
And we can do it in a team, of course, but this requires time. And is the time to exchange also a time slot in our work contract, or
Yes.
it's yeah.
Yeah, that's more a systemic problem.
Systemic problem.
Yeah.
Also, yeah. But if we achieve it, it's beautiful.
Are there other questions, comments?
want to add to this. It's not actually a question. So I'm electrical matters. I also participate in the upskills project. My impression is that it is not so with the lectures. It is not so much about being opinionated, but I think with experience, there is a growing awareness of the effort we invested in doing things in a certain way. So it's very difficult. I don't think it's just conscious decision, but I think it's very difficult to decide to invest more time. And one of the ideas of our project is to try to mitigate this effect by offering new teaching materials, so to make this transition easier. So I think it can hold time is trying together.
Was implying when I said that those things just start working for the lunch. And basically, if you have already have a system that works, why would you change? That's why, yeah, precisely. That's what we're trying to do by giving these teacher, I mean, you're going to hear about it, teacher guides among certain materials, it essentially to inspire people that will listen. For you, you can use it to test it out.
So I had a question if no one else.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I didn't just
You came with a question.
Exactly, I didn't just randomly show up in the screen. I also realized we never really introduced ourselves. So I'm Marko Simonovic. This is Boban Rsinijevic. Can you move so that the camera moves to you? So we co-organized. We're the local co-organizers of this event. So I was really happy to hear that kind of Crashen is back in a way, or at least
Yeah,
I
would say so.
you're promoting him in a way. And I was thinking, so I'm coordinating a part that has to do with research-based teaching, where you kind of try to really do your research as you do it, but then with the students, in front of the students, and kind of hope that they pick up spontaneously. And at some point I realized, like when I talk research, in class,
Yeah.
I was like, oh, I'm doing like, I'm just like Crashen. I'm when he speaks German to people who never heard German, hoping that they will kind of pick up many things implicitly. And then you don't have to tell them what, an alternative hypothesis is. You just use it in 5 sentences that make sense, and they pick it up, and it becomes kind of part of their implicit knowledge, and you never had to go explicit. So I feel like, there's even further implications of this model working for how many things we introduce explicitly and how many we just, transfer as skills by exposing people to those skills.
Content, yeah.
So yeah, this was more of a remark than a question.
Yeah, sure.
But thanks, this was really extremely useful.
There's time for one brief one, or if not, then let's take Barbara Hinger again. Thank you very much. And now we have 15 minutes break, and then there is a session in which we will have 4 presentations, each 15 minutes, presenting the different intellectual outputs that constitute our project, well, this spine of intellectual outputs, and some time also for feedback and discussion. So we really invite the audience to also think about the feedbacks that they can give us, or critical issues like criticism about our approach or something that we could do additionally, and so on. Thank you. So now 15 minutes break.